does morality show the existence of God? Many theists, such as C.S. Lewis and William Lane Craig, have thought that it does, that the objectively true moral law must have a lawgiver, and that lawgiver is none other than God. However, this argument is not generally recognized as one of the better arguments for God's existence, for reasons we'll get into later. But might there be hope for this argument after all? Or at least for a version of it? That's the intriguing proposal recently put forth by Trent Horn, a prominent Catholic apologist on YouTube. In this video, we're going to find out just what Horn's new and improved version of the moral argument is, and whether it works. First, to clear the way for his version of the argument, Horn sets aside the more traditional and less plausible versions. One of these versions that he dismisses is the claim that you can't act morally unless you believe in God. As Horn rightly points out, this argument is a non-starter, given that many atheists clearly do behave in moral ways. Now, a second version of the moral argument holds that objective moral facts entail God's existence. For example, it's an objective moral fact, a moral law, that you ought not to harm someone without justification. And according to this argument, that moral law could not exist unless God was there to set it in place. While this argument is not as bad as the previous one, Horn points out that it has a major problem. Namely, the atheist can simply suppose that objective moral facts are more or less baked into the universe, much like mathematical and logical facts. Take, for example, the objective moral fact that suffering is bad. The atheist might say that this is just a brute, originless, self-evident truth about the world, one comparable to the truth that 2 + 2 = 4. It's not obvious what the problem with this maneuver would be, as the resulting view seems, at the very least, coherent. So Horn, to his credit, recognizes the problems with these versions of the moral argument. But he goes on to claim that there's a more modest version of the moral argument available, one that he alleges is more difficult for the atheist to refute.
The best moral argument for God's existence focuses on being modest and zeroing in on the most puzzling moral facts to explain from a naturalist perspective.
According to this more modest version of the moral argument, there's a set of moral truths that are puzzling to explain if there's no God, but that are fairly easy to explain if there is a God. In a moment, we'll talk about what these alleged moral truths are, but first, note that this argument, as an inference to the best explanation, is not meant to show conclusively that God exists. Rather, it's meant simply to provide at least some evidence that God exists. Relatedly, this new version of the argument doesn't say anything about God being necessary for objective moral truths to exist at all. Rather, the focus is on a particular set of moral truths. So what are these moral truths, or at least alleged moral truths? Most of Horn's examples have to do with human dignity. For instance, while he acknowledges that there are non-theistic explanations of why murder is wrong in general, such as that it causes suffering or frustrates the victim's plans and projects, he goes on to suggest that atheism has trouble accounting for why the killing of a cognitively impaired human, or a human with less capacity for suffering, is a more serious matter than killing a non-human animal, such as a dog, that happens to have a greater degree of rationality or a greater capacity for suffering. Horn's thought seems to be that humans have an intrinsic dignity that categorically gives them a greater moral importance than non-human animals, regardless of whether a given human happens to be more rational than a given non-human animal. Horn also appeals to infanticide as an act whose wrongness atheism has trouble explaining. He points out, for instance, how certain figures, such as Destiny and Jeff McMahon, concede that on their view, certain forms of infanticide need not be wrong. For example, killing a healthy, orphaned newborn so that one could use its organs to save 3 sick children. Of course, many or most atheists would not be willing to bite the bullet here, and would maintain more of a hardline stance against infanticide. But Horn goes on to say that their reasons for finding infanticide wrong would also be reasons for finding abortion wrong. For instance, if infanticide is wrong because the child is close to becoming a person, or because other people could adopt the child, well, those reasons arguably apply to preborn children as well. Okay, so why can't atheists who take a hardline stance against infanticide, but who are also currently pro-choice, just update their view and become pro-life? As a side note, it's around here that Horn's argument becomes a little harder to figure out. He notes that over 90% of atheists identify as pro-choice, but he doesn't say very clearly how appealing to the standard reasons against infanticide as being equally reasons against abortion would involve any kind of cost for atheism. And on that note, we should keep in mind that some of the most respected anti-abortion arguments don't appeal to any religious premises. For example, Don Marquis, in his widely anthologized paper Why Abortion is Immoral, argues that abortion is wrong because it takes away a future of value from the fetus, and that this feature, namely taking away a future of value from the victim, is what makes killing more generally wrong. For an atheist to use an argument like this to ground their opposition to abortion would not involve any obvious tension, so it's indeed a bit puzzling how abortion is supposed to tie into Horn's broader argument. But Horn does go on to point to a further category of moral truths, namely certain truths concerning sexual ethics that are supposedly difficult for the atheist to explain. For instance, whereas atheists generally ground their sexual ethics on considerations like bodily autonomy, and appeal to the violation of bodily autonomy as being what explains the wrongness of rape, it seems that bodily autonomy alone is not going to help us explain the wrongness of something like incest. It's here that Horn brings up an example put forth by Andrew Wilson in a debate with Naima. The example involves two adult twin brothers who decide to get it on. Since they're both adults, the example brackets out any concerns about grooming. Since they're both male, there's no concern about having deformed offspring. On that note, the example also includes that the brothers don't have any other family, to head off any concerns about making the rest of their family upset. When posed with the question of whether, on the basis of bodily autonomy, such an act of incest would be wrong, Naima was forced to concede, though with some apparent discomfort, that it would not be.
Your whole family dies in a tragic accident except your twin brother. So now you can't destroy them emotionally because they're all dead. Is it okay or moral then to have a twin brother incestuous relationship based on your principle of bodily autonomy?
I guess if you're not hurting anyone, including yourself, then sure. But I don't think that this negates the basic belief that bodily autonomy is a human right.
Other examples of allegedly disordered or immoral sex acts that Horn brings up include consensual necrophilia and bestiality. Horn thinks that the wrongness of such acts can't ultimately be explained by appealing to consent or bodily autonomy. For example, whereas some might try to argue that bestiality is wrong because animals can't consent to sex with a human, such an argument runs into trouble from the fact that many animals appear capable of consenting to things that are much more dangerous than non-penetrative sex with a human. For instance, Horn points out that working for the police requires that you be a consenting adult. Yet most people don't think that there's any problem with the police having K9 units. Here, then, we have a whole set of moral truths that Horn alleges are difficult to explain under atheism. These moral truths tend to center on some kind of human dignity, a dignity that attaches to our very species and that transcends the cognitive abilities of any given member of our species. This human dignity is an immaterial, highly valuable property, a property that's puzzling to make sense of in a godless universe. By contrast, this human dignity is much easier to make sense of if all humans are made in God's image and are loved by God. Thus, by way of inference to the best explanation, we have here some significant evidence for the existence of God. And that, in a nutshell, is Horn's argument. As I mentioned earlier, this is an interesting variation on the more traditional moral argument. Horn's version of the argument is certainly more modest and more of a challenge for the atheist to respond to. So how might the atheist respond? I see a few paths the atheist could take. The first is that, for at least some, and maybe even all, of Horn's alleged moral truths that are difficult for the atheist to explain, the atheist could argue that they are not in fact moral truths in the first place. To the extent that the atheist effectively does this, Horn's argument won't get off the ground. And many atheists certainly do take this path. Horn himself points to philosophers like Jeff McMahon and Michael Tooley, who have argued that there are circumstances in which infanticide is permissible, along with Peter Singer and David Benatar, who have either endorsed or, at the very least, flirted with the possibility that bestiality is permissible. Now, Horn would probably say that taking this path just seems crazy on its face. But this wouldn't be a very satisfying maneuver. Given that the relevant viewpoints have been seriously defended, an incredulous stare would not be enough for a rebuttal. Of course, Some would say that acts like incest, necrophilia, and bestiality trigger our disgust, and that this is a clue to their being morally wrong. But this also would not be a good argument, and for reasons that Horn himself recognizes. In fact, in a different video, Horn explicitly rejects arguments from disgust. As he points out, disgust is not a very reliable moral guide. It all too easily leads to poor moral judgments. An example he gives is of how we might feel a certain disgust from imagining two elderly spouses having sex. Surely, despite whatever disgust we might feel for it, the two spouses aren't doing anything immoral. Granted, views which are friendly to acts like incest or infanticide or bestiality are certainly unpopular, which makes for some rhetorical difficulty in presenting them. I suspect that it's primarily this rhetorical difficulty, rather than any intellectual difficulty or implausibility, that's behind the occasional moments where, as Horn notices, debaters like Naima seem reluctant to acknowledge the consequences of their view. But denying that some or all of Horn's alleged moral truths are in fact moral truths is not the only way the atheist could respond to Horn's argument. Another way the atheist might respond is to affirm some or even all of Horn's alleged moral truths, but to add that God doesn't make them any easier to explain. As an example, suppose for a moment that God regards humans as special, and that this is what's being put forth as the explanation of the moral truths Horn appeals to, like how it's worse to kill a human than a non-human animal. Then we'd immediately face the question, does God have a reason for regarding humans as special? If God does, then the atheist can appeal to that reason just as well, whatever it may be. For instance, if God's reason for regarding humans as special is that only humans as a species have a rational nature, then the atheist can say that being part of a species with a rational nature makes one special, and that this is simply a moral truth baked into the universe, much like the truths of logic or math. Now, some might worry that taking on board ethical claims like these would make the atheist's view unparsimonious. But we should remember that any reason God might appeal to for regarding humans as special would have to be, in an important sense, independent of God. So any metaphysical baggage that atheism might pick up from making the relevant moral claims would be had equally by theism. And then, with theism, there's the whole added claim of the existence of God in the first place. So, parsimony-wise, theism wouldn't seem to have any advantage here over atheism. On the other hand, the theist could hold that God does not have a reason for, say, regarding humans as special. But the problem then would be that God's regard for humans as special would simply be arbitrary, and this would appear to undermine whatever normative significance it might have had. Here, of course, I'm channeling the classic Euthyphro dilemma. In its most general formulation, the dilemma could be put as the question: are good actions good because God commands them, or does God command them because they're good? For the reason touched on a moment ago, this dilemma is widely seen as a fatal objection to divine command theory, or the view that morality is determined by God's commands. Near the end of his video, Horn addresses the Euthyphro dilemma, but what he says about it is not very satisfying. On Horn's view, God's commands are good because God is perfect by nature, such that when God commands something, God isn't appealing to any moral standard higher than himself, but also isn't being arbitrary. Instead, the moral commands flow directly from God's own nature, as, by definition, a being who is perfect in every way. The trouble I see with this maneuver is that it simply raises the question of what it is that makes God perfect. In particular, is God perfect because of some set of properties God has, such as being maximally honest and maximally compassionate? If one takes this path, then we're left to conclude that there's a moral standard independent of God, a moral standard to the effect that it's good to embrace properties like honesty and compassion. Or, on the other hand, is it the case that God would be perfect no matter what other properties God had? If one takes this path, then perfection becomes an arbitrary standard. When a being would count as perfect, even if that being were not compassionate or honest or just, but instead cruel and petty and vindictive, then the whole notion of perfection as something worth embodying or worth aiming for seems to have lost its meaning. And so, looking back, although Horn's more modest version of the moral argument for God is indeed more plausible than the other versions of the moral argument, and while it raises some interesting questions, there are some serious problems with it. But what do you think? Is Horn's version of the moral argument as beset by problems as I've suggested it is? Or might there be hope for it after all? If you have any thoughts you'd like to add, feel free to share them in the comments. Also, if you liked this discussion, you might enjoy this video, where I analyze a debate between Destiny and Lila Rose on the moral status of abortion.